Chapter 16. Spirit Fox. Henceforth, the duo turned into a trio. Dongting was one of Zhou Zishu's destinations regardless, so he had no objections. There was a type of people who lived their life in such normality, it would only cause headaches for them to be forced to think outside of the box. An example of this would be cow whining. Additionally, there was another type who couldn't help but look deeper into everything and anything, confusing themselves with many possibilities before they could even realize it. An example of this would be Zhou Zishu. Zhou Zishu and Wen Kexing went back to their usual routine of trading quips and insults back and forth with unending enthusiasm, trying to probe the other incessantly. Cow whining, after listening to them confusedly, gave the final conclusion, "You two have such an admirable camaraderie." Zhou Zishu shut up, glancing at cow whining in complete silence. He knew the patriarch of Qingfeng sword sect was an old sly fox. How on earth did that man manage to raise an innocent rabbit like this one? Wen Kexing unabashedly took advantage of that to wrap his arms around Zhou Zishu's shoulders, smiling at cow whining, "Thank you, young Master Cow. In fact, I have made up my mind that in this lifetime I will marry no one else but Brother Zhou." Cow whining's mouth was as wide open as his eyes. Zhou Zishu shot back, "Being used to it already, I'm afraid I have to let Brother Wen down. With my incurable illness, I won't live on for much longer. What good will it do to bind yourself to this slowly dying soul?" Wen Kexing replied seriously, "If you're gone, I will remain solitary till the end of my life." Zhou Zishu's words carried daggers. For a great mind to suffer loneliness is often destiny, who am I to tamper with it? Wen Kexing was undaunted, "Come on, don't be too humble, Ah Shu, that's way too polite of you." Zhou Zishu quickly waved his hands, "Not at all, why would I be?" Cow whining's gaze went back and forth between the two of them. When he came back to his senses, he blurted out a question. "Is it Brother Zhou's illness that is obstructing your feelings for each other?" After a short moment of silence, Wen Kexing burst out laughing, feeling very fond of cow whining. Zhou Zishu coughed after a good while, removing Wen Kexing's arms that were around his neck and replying with a solemn face. "Brother Cow need not think too much into it, the closest that I and Brother Wen can become is an estranged pair." Cow whining frowned, thinking the other was trying to delude himself. "A person like Brother Zhou should not suffer like this," he said in sorrow. Zhou Zishu smiled back bitterly, "Thank you Brother Cow, but I don't feel the slightest. My master is acquainted with some peculiar figures in Zhonghu, fortunately a few of them are from Shaman Medicine Valley. It'd be wonderful if Brother Zhou can come with me back home after dealing with matters concerning the unorthodox sects. My master definitely possesses means that can help you." Zhou Zishu was moved to tears, so he kept his mouth shut. Unexpectedly, cow whining was a true man of action, so he immediately made a fist palm salute. "Wait for me at the end, I will go send a message to my uncle." He turned around and left right after. Wen Kexing praised, "How enthusiastic, truly a man who can be my match." He turned his head to Zhou Zishu, studying him somewhat pensively. Wen Kexing paused, then asked, "What is it? Did my passionate words earlier manage to reach Ashu's heart after all? Are you planning to reciprocate with your body?" Zhou Zishu smiled coldly, "Forgive me, but I feel like Brother Wen's motives behind going to Dongting are quite puzzling." Wen Kexing turned serious, "Helping people in need and being generous are only small virtues. Do you know what bigger virtues are?" Zhou Zishu narrowed his eyes, staring at the other man without a word. Wen Kexing replied slowly, "A day with an empty hell is a day further from ascending. Good and evil has always been impossible to coexist ever since ancient time, don't you think?" When he said this, his calm gaze was directed at somewhere far away, revealing his handsome side profile. His usual playful demeanor was gone without a trace, and he looked like an expressionless Buddha stone statue. "This is the mortal world," he continued, "and in the mortal world, monsters shouldn't exist. That respectable and virtuous Sir Gao Chang wants to extinguish evils for the sake of everyone. If I don't lend him a hand, all the years of reading holy books will go to waste. It's said that only after years and years of cultivation is one able to land in this realm. It will be for nothing if they don't make a mark for themselves." Zhou Zishu still stayed silent. Wen Kexing looked back at him. "What do you think, Ashu?" After a long while, Zhou Zishu laughed softly. "Brother Wen speaks as if you are a true gentleman." Wen Kexing didn't answer straight to the point. "There are three types of people in this world, the ones who can eat meat, ones who don't mind it, and ones who can't stand it. This is how they are born to be. But isn't it hilarious if the first type is born into poverty and the third type is born into luxury?" Zhou Zishu, after a bout of stillness, spoke leisurely and carefully, "Brother Wen talks about such mysteries that I'm unable to understand. However, I do know one thing." "And what is it?" One won't stay unchanged once thrust into a different situation. Wen Kexing was startled at that for a few seconds. Then he laughed out loud, unconstrained, to the point of tearing up. Zhou Zishu watched him, expressions remaining the same, his sickly skin not betraying any emotions. His eyelids lowered, and he looked like he wanted to search deep inside Wen Kexing's soul. After an unknown amount of time, Wen Kexing stood upright again, breathing hard, hands wiping the tears at the corner of his eyes. Ah Shu, I've found out that you are the first person in my entire lifetime that suits my taste the most. You know, I am actually a little knowledgeable in the art of disguise too. He looked at Zhou Zishu without blinking, to the point that even the fake layer of skin on his face felt uncomfortable. He answered without thinking, are you really? Wen Kexing said with absolute sincerity, therefore maybe I will transform myself into Gu Xiong. Zhou Zishu stood there in a daze. When he saw that Wen Kexing was looking at him up and down crudely, he immediately recomposed himself, turning to head towards the inn without a word. Wen Kexing stared after his back, his gaze drawn to the shoulder blades hidden under clothes. To him, even when the other man was dressing in rags and looked dejected in his own misery, there was always an indescribable aura that he exuded. It took him back to that afternoon with the brilliant sun, when Zhou Zishu closed his eyes and leaned onto the wall by the main street, his beggar-like demeanor looking more relaxed than anyone else in this world. But Wen Kexing knew that he was only sunbathing. How can such a man not be a stunning beauty? Wen Kexing thought smugly. During the near 30 years he had lived, he had never been wrong about that. Seeing that Zhou Zishu was now far away, Wen Kexing hurried after him, mumbling under his breath, how can one ever know if they will change? And whether one is averse to meat or not, won't it be miserable anyway if they're thrown into a desolate place with nothing else to devour? At nightfall, Cao Whining caught up to them. He felt the atmosphere between the other two had become strange, so he asked cautiously, did Brother Zhou and Brother Wen have a quarrel? Don't think too much into it, Brother Cao. They replied at the same time, again. Wen Kexing narrowed his eyes at Zhou Zishu, his gaze sharp and full of tease. Zhou Zishu feigned ignorance. Cao Whining scratched his head. Actually, I don't know how to word this, but yes, I have heard of such a thing before, but never in my life have I seen it with real men. Wen Kexing looked at him silently, so he continued hurriedly, please don't be mistaken, Brother Wen, I don't mean anything else, although it is a little difficult to take in, but you are both very chivalrous individuals. It's a little strange, but... He coughed, please don't take my words seriously, we always have to act and speak proper. Zhou Zishu poured a cup of wine for himself leisurely and took a few sips. Silly boy is getting his words tangled up, he thought. Cao Whining then lowered his head and only looked up after a good while, his face red and his voice small, so. Do you two want separate rooms or just one room? Zhou Zishu choked on his wine. Even Wen Kexing had to stare at Cao Whining and thought, we've found a treasure of a boy, haven't we? The atmosphere among the three turned weird. No one spoke, only Zhou Zishu was making coughing sounds. But suddenly, there was a piercing scream from the upper floor, making the few guests downstairs raise their heads. They saw the waiter stumble down like he had just seen a ghost, his voice quivering. A murder. Cao Whining's face was all serious as he grabbed his sword and head upstairs. There was a pair of man and woman who did this at the same time. They dressed neatly and looked like brother and sister. There were always people who couldn't stop themselves from worrying about others' business. Wen Kexing kicked at Zhou Zishu with his foot. Ah Shu, won't you go check it out? Zhou Zishu stood up and lowered his upper body, you first. Wen Kexing rushed upstairs. When he was passing by Zhou Zishu, he suddenly slowed down and got closer, his voice low. If you spend the night with me, I will turn into Gu Xiong as you wish. I'm really honored, but I'd rather sleep in the stable. Wen Kexing clicked his tongue, glancing at the other, you're no fun. Zhou Zishu followed close behind him. The moment they reached the second floor, the smell of blood was right in their face. The door to the room was wide open. Cao Whining stood there with a grave expression, turning to beckon the two forward once he saw them. You should come look at this person. Zhou Zishu walked toward him and saw a man propped up by the bedpost, his clothes in a state of sloppiness, revealing his chest. On it was a black mark in the shape of a hand. His arms were cut off and thrown into a corner, blood splattering everywhere. The corpse's head lolled to one side, eyes unfocused, face pale. It was evident that he had been dead for a while. Wen Kexing was oohing and eyeing. This one looks like the thief who crashed into me the other day. Cao Whining also let out an awe, and looked closer at the dead body, his expression complicated. He also looks like the one who crashed into me. The two men who shared the same fate and had to rely on Zhou Zishu for help stared at each other, feeling a deep sense of solidarity. Then they heard the girl beside them spoke, "I know this person, he's Fang Buzi, the nine-claw spirit fox." Chapter 17. Lapis. Cao Whining asked in a stupor. He's that deplorable thief Fang Buzi? The young maiden nodded, pointing at the corpse's left hand. It is said that Fang Buzi is a man in his 30s and has a deformed left hand. There is also an unconfirmed rumor that. Her face went pink as she stopped there. Zhou Zishu studied the body's face and clean-shaven chin. He continued in her stead, "Also, there is a rumor that Fang Buzi has another deformity on his body. Should our young lady feel uncomfortable, it is better that you go outside first or turn your back to us. Removing his pants will confirm whether he is the legendary thief or not." The girl glanced at her male companion in embarrassment. He coughed lightly. "Xiaolian, you should go." She went outside and waited by the door, her back facing the room. The moment she turned away, Wen Kexing expertly stripped down the dead's trousers to reveal that a particular part of the body had been cut off. He rubbed his chin and thought. So it is him, no wonder I couldn't feel anything out of the ordinary when he touched before. Unwavering and completely unbothered, he continued to remove Fang Buzi's clothes entirely and searched around. He found his money pouch among a big pile of assorted items and opened it, overjoyed when he found out nothing had been lost. With perfect contentment, he put it back in his chest pocket, not forgetting to tell Cao Whining politely, "Brother Cao, come over here and see if your stuffs are still here." Cao Whining and the other young man stared at him, dumbstruck. Zhou Zishu reminded him with a cold tone. "The dead is more important right now, Mr. Charitable Wen." He ignored the stranger's approving look, adding, "Can you pay me back now?" Wen Kexing's face was full of grief. "We already belong to each other, why are you still haggling over that?" As the young man's expression became even more entertaining, Zhou Zishu gripped Wen Kexing's collar and threw the nuisance of a man aside. He squatted down to examine the body from head to toe, then frowned afterwards and concluded, he died after a single blow. The attack went through his body from chest to back, clearly the result of the Raksha palm. The stranger exclaimed, "You're talking about the delighted morning ghost's Raksha palm?" "I'm afraid so." Zhou Zishu nodded, covering the body. He turned to the girl outside the door. "You can come in now, young miss." The man sized them up, then made a salute. "My name is Deng Quan, disciple of Gao Chong, and this is my junior apprentice sister Gao Xiaolian. We were traveling to accumulate experience, but a few days ago a message was received from my master, so we had to rush back before Dong Ting's gathering. How may I address you?" Cao Whining hurried to answer. Many apologies for our tactlessness, it is an honor to meet you, young Sir Deng. And surely this young miss must be Sir Gao's daughter. My name is Cao Whining from Qingfeng Sword Sect, currently following my patriarch's order to attend Dong Ting. My uncle will also be there soon enough, and on the way I ran into this thief master. It was fortunate of me to have been assisted by Brother Zhou and Brother Wen here. Deng Quan said, "Then from where do you two brave?" Zhou Zishu, still squatting, turned to him at that and smiled. "You overestimated our bravery. I'm called Zhou Shu, a mere spontaneous wanderer who belongs to no sex. As for that one." He pointed at Wen Kexing, pausing a little for dramatic effect. "He is Wen Kexing. He might look gentlemanly, but in truth he is a deeply experienced dirty hoodlum." Wen Kexing replied calmly, "I've only ever been teasing to you, Shu." Zhou Zishu's voice was light. "And I'm glad I'm a priority." Gao Xiaolian's attention was evidently no longer on the body. In contrast, Deng Quan didn't seem perturbed, only smiling back kindly with an attitude that was neither cowering nor arrogant, the manners of a true hero from the orthodox sects and someone who belonged to the leading force in Dongting. "How humorous of you two. If you come with Brother Cao to Dongting, then you are one of us. Didn't Brother Zhou say that this thief also died under the Raksha palm of the delighted morning sun?" He and Gao Xiaolian glanced at each other while Zhou Zishu and Wen Kexing played dumb with their expression of ignorance. Cao Whining ended up asking, "Also? I heard that the outskirts of the Zhao's holdings was disturbed by the ghosts, did they?" Gao Xiaolian replied. "So young Sir Cao did not know. A while before, a message was sent from Tai Hu, saying that Sir Mu Yunj of Duan Jian Manor, who was a guest of the Zayas at that time, had been murdered by the Raksha palm. The ghosts of the valley have caused numerous atrocities, how dare they be this arrogant? This place was not far from Dongting as it would take at most a day to get there, it wasn't wrong to consider them already in Great Sir Gao's domain. It was not clear whether this young lady was so worked up over justice or merely over the fact that there was someone intruding on her father's territory. Nonetheless, Deng Quan and Cao Weining nodded on instinct. Correct. Absolutely. Back when the pugilist scene formed the greatest alliance, there were 3 pieces of the realm's command, each in the possession of a respectable figure. They could only be used in a time of great urgency. When the pieces were put together, a hero gathering could be held with the participants being anyone with talent and gallantry. One piece was in Iron Judge Gao Chong's hands, one in the Shaolin Monastery S1, and the last piece was rumored to belong to the reclusive hermit monk Gu of Mount Ming. It was quite unexpected for the unrest about the Ghost Valley to reach even the infamous monk Gu, who was too engrossed in his cultivation endeavor to pay any attention to the outside world. After Deng Quan discussed with Cao Weining, they consulted the rest and decided to hire a carriage to deliver Fang Buzi's corpse to Gao Chong immediately in the night, preventing further complications. Cao Weining and Deng Quan seemed to have seen their match in each other. Their first meeting seemed like that of old friends. Zhou Zishu stayed detached. He had no idea how Gao Chong was like as a person, but at least he had taught his disciples and daughter to be decent people. Gao Xiaolian walked beside them and chiming in at times, her tactfulness and manners a complete contrast to her youth. She was around the same age as Gu Xiang, but was in no way prone to being loud or conceited, an exemplary lady. Wen Kexing suddenly sighed and lamented, if only my Gu Xiang can learn something or two from young Miss Gao. Gao Xiaolian smiled at him graciously, please don't flatter me, big brother Wen. Zhou Zishu scoffed, voice lowered, young lady Gao is Sir Gao's daughter after all, and Gu Xiang. She's a good kid, but it's inevitable for her to not follow her superior's footsteps. Wen Kexing's face was entirely serious. Ah Shu, I'm only praising Miss Gao truthfully, you don't have to get jealous. Gao Xiaolian immediately glanced at them in utter embarrassment and hurried ahead to catch up to Deng Quan and Cao Weining, leaving Zhou Zishu and Wen Kexing behind. Zhou Zishu laughed softly. Brother Wen, there is one matter that has been plaguing my mind, why was Fang Buzi's clothes in a disheveled state when we walked in? From what I know, good old Fang wasn't the type to have a normal routine. Wen Kexing, using his hand to support his chin, turned things over in his mind for a few minutes then asked, you mean the delighted morning ghost had taken a liking to Fang Buzi and the latter struggled to fight off the former's advances, so he killed his unattainable object of fancy in a fit of rage? He shook his head and sighed after that, after all, it has always been inevitable for beauties to suffer. Zhou Zishu replied, his expression betraying nothing. What an excellent explanation from Brother Wen, why did I ever think that the murderer must have killed Fang Buzi for something on his body? Wen Kexing choked on his words briefly, pretending to agree. Sounds reasonable enough. He turned his head to see Zhou Zishu looking at him meaningfully. The other man asked, did Brother Wen lose anything else that day beside from the pouch? Wen Kexing faced his eyes directly and confessed. Yes. The money was intact, but the piece of lapis armor was nowhere to be found. The smile on Zhou Zishu's face slowly receded, his eyes dark and cold as if submerged in ice. Wen Kexing looked innocent and smiling as usual. After a good while, Zhou Zishu lowered his voice. What are we to do about this, Mr. Charitable Wen? You didn't kill him, but he died because of you. Wen Kexing fell silent. At that moment ahead of them, Cao Weining and Deng Quan were discussing Zhou Zishu's illness. Deng Quan turned around, about to ask if he could manage traveling through the night and if they should hire another carriage for him, but he sensed a change of atmosphere between the two men. Wen Kexing was no longer smiling, and there was an unreadable flash in Zhou Zishu's eyes. Deng Quan felt puzzled and was going to inquire the two further when Wen Kexing suddenly laughed, his hand as quick as lightning gripping Zhou Zishu's chin as he leaned down and kissed him. Deng Quan stood there stunned, but educated as he was, he turned away awkwardly after a few minutes, feigning calmness at the dazed Gao Xiaolian and Cao Weining. Then, us four should take steps in advance, let's do that. Too bad he miscounted the moment he phased out. When the three of them ditched without looking back, Zhou Zishu broke away from Wen Kexing's grip, ruthlessly delivering a punch to the other's abdomen, his expression cold. The joke is not funny, Brother Wen. Wen Kexing bent forward to clutch at his stomach, an unnerving hint of a smile still evident on his face. I didn't kill him, but he died because of me? Have you considered that you're wrong, Ah Shu? Zhou Zishu watched him icily. Wen Kexing slowly straightened up. In the middle of the empty road at nighttime, his voice was low, almost like a sigh. Inside the lapis armor is either the greatest martial art guide or a treasure from a rival country, who wouldn't want it? His mouth curled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Fang Buzi didn't give a damn about what he stole, Even if it's charity money, as long as it satisfied his greed, why wouldn't he want it? The delighted morning ghost was forced to enter the valley for his crimes and lives a life that is half hell, so why wouldn't he want it? Why wouldn't you? You say you have to gather merits only because you don't want your past sins to come up once you're judged in the underworld, and if there exists an object that can make you unbeatable and untouched by ghosts, why wouldn't you want it? Joe's issue shook his head slowly, scoffing. I've never been afraid of ghosts knocking on my door. He walked away briskly without looking back. When CH.16 watched his back, his expressions dark and indecipherable. Suddenly he laughed out loud. You've got good taste in kasha wine, my dear St. Joe. While Joe's issue tried to ignore it, he couldn't help but wiping his mouth ferociously with his sleeves, cursing, damn you and CH.16. Chapter 18. Dongting. Dongting was bustling with noise and people. In just one night, figures from all trades across Jianghu were gathered here, and after having proclaimed their titles among themselves, each started pursuing their own ulterior motives. Joe's issues group, during their meal at 2 taverns, had already witnessed at least 3 fights breaking out before the day could end. Joe's issue felt like this place was no better than a dog market, with people incessantly barking at each other and competing over some of the most trivial matters ever. He wondered how this gathering of heroes would turn out. Ding Quan and Gao Xiaolian took them to see Gao Chong first and foremost. There were only 3 factions who possessed the realm's command. Shaolin was highly respected in the pugilist scene, with their strength being their raw power, and Munfu of Mount Changming was elusive but greatly admired, known for his martial arts skills. The most socialized out of all of them was Sir Gao, as he had a wide circle of acquaintances spreading across many big sects, and therefore was the one with the biggest influence among the 3. He was actually not at all the type of hero with a pleasant appearance and graceful manners. At first glance he looked neither handsome nor wicked, but an old, short and stout man with grey temple hair. When he talked, there was an evident healthy spirit to him, and his laugh was especially loud and hearty. One look at him and Joe's issue understood how he got his current status. Each person had their own unique aura, and people would flock together, separating into groups based on this invisible element. An example would be the type of people like when CH.16 and Joe's issue. One looked like a sickly, staggering beggar and the other a silver-tongued, male beauty-loving troublemaker. They weren't that special at first glance, but someone with a sharp mind could easily sense the subtle distinctions to them once acquainted. It was possible that both Joe's issue and when CH.16 could blend in a crowd without anyone noticing, but after all they weren't that type, so naturally there was no reason for them to do such a thing. Furthermore, blending in would only turn them into unremarkable props. But Joe's issue would raise his guards every time when CH.16 got near, and during their first meeting when CH.16 had warned Gu Xian against provoking the other men. It was a kind of instinct that helped one identify their peers. This wasn't a thing in Gao Chong's case, however. He could be on friendly terms with anyone, and people would overlook everything from his age to his status the moment they stood before him. Whether one was young or old, from righteous sex or was simply a knight-errant, he could always evoke a sense of familiarity in them, one which made them feel like they were of the same age and actually experienced a part of life together. Joe's issue and when CH.16 involuntarily stopped their nonsensical blabbering to observe this infamous Sir Gao silently, only exchanging necessary small talks at random and with politeness. Joe's issue couldn't help but think, if only Tian Chuang had such a talent. But there was only one Gao Chong in this whole world. They arrived relatively early. A few days later, one by one came the big sex representatives and Dongting Lake had very likely turned into a place for family reunion. Every day one would hear something along the line of, you must be someone, I have heard a lot about you. Please don't flatter me, of course, the Ghost Valley has been on their evil rampage for way too long, we will not stop before they are eradicated, it is natural that I will lend my strength, so that we can finally make a move in the name of justice and righteousness. During the past days, Joe's issue had to listen to them until his ears couldn't bear it anymore. But when he was bored out of his mind, when CH.16 was nowhere to be seen. It was a bit quiet without the other man's rowdiness. He was strolling along the street, wearing new robes provided by the Gao family. It was obvious this was a benefit from mingling with Cao Wei Ning's crowd, as he got to enjoy a pleasant stay at the Gao's residence with delicious food and nice clothes to replace his ragged ensemble. It actually took a while for him to get used to the new clothes. He had worn rough materials for so long that the smooth fabric felt slippery and cold to the touch, just like a layer of mucus. He shook his head in self-mockery at his sallow, skinny hands and sallow, skinny face. This nail-ravaged body seemed incapable of handling the clothes currently hanging on its frame, not unlike a shaky skeleton struggling to prop up the fabrics. He himself could see the wretchedness in his appearance, and a random glance at the mirror was enough to warrant no further inspection. It was clear that even a dragon robe would not make one a crown prince. Internally, he thought Wen Kexing was only mindlessly chasing after him. With the lack of those courtesans with their pretty handkerchiefs, beggars couldn't be choosers. That was obviously why the man glued himself to him to ramble his ears off. Wasn't there a saying that after 3 years in the army, even a sow will look like a goddess? Zhou's issue felt like Wen Kexing's situation was no different, only he was interested in boars rather than sows. Today he visited a tavern on his own. He chose a seat by the window and asked for some side dishes and a pot of yellow wine, drinking it leisurely while sunbathing. Wen Kexing saw the other man's back the moment he walked in. It was unclear why he always got a very distinct feeling from looking at Zhou's issue's back, to the point that he could recognize it immediately in a crowd. His back wasn't always straightened, oftentimes it would lazily curve in a way that didn't at all affect his elegance and gave the impression of an incredibly comfortable person. Wen Kexing found out there seemed to be not a single matter that could plague his mind, and one would feel unusually peaceful and comforted the moment they landed their eyes on him. He couldn't help but stop walking to stare blankly at Zhou's issue's relaxed figure. An emotion surged up within him, the emotion of nothingness. It was as if the man's attitude was presented to mock all of those out there with worries heavy on their mind but had to pretend that they were the opposite. Zhou, soul like water lenses, body like willow, he thought. The world was boundless with so many paths and sceneries to behold and experience, so how could one completely disregard all of those and keep himself in complete desolation, with no worries on his mind? He was definitely not indifferent. He had a variety of emotions, but they came and went in a blink of an eye, seemingly never existing in the first place. Wen Kexing inhaled deeply and cast his eyes downwards. Soon enough, back on his face was an irritatingly cheerful expression as he walked over and sat down opposite Zhou's issue. He took a cup without asking and snatched the wine pot from Zhou's issue's hand, pouring one for himself and commented after a small sip, "Not too bad, this wine." Zhou's issue glanced at him languidly and spoke up, "Excuse me, can I have another pot?" Put it on his tabs. Wen Kexing stared back silently. Zhou's issue gave him a soft smile, and to prove that he wasn't a stingy person, he explained, "You still owed me 3 silver liangs. I'm just providing a chance for you to pay me back early without additional interest. That totally works in your favor, right?" After a long while, Wen Kexing could only let out a thanks. "You're welcome, brother Wen." Zhou's issue smiled back. Wen Kexing had an unusually strong urge to tease him back, but at that moment, the tavern door behind Zhou's issue opened and there were voices, "We will stay here for a meal for the time being. Then we can go see Brother Gao in the evening." A somewhat familiar voice replied, "Of course, anything you say, uncle." As soon as that happened, Wen Kexing got to witness a highly entertaining scene. His former creditor, who minutes ago was completely sober while being helpful with his debt, suddenly swayed side to side and fell onto the table drunkenly with a crashing noise. His fingers were still gripping the wine cup and his face was glued to the table. He looked as if he wanted to stand up but couldn't figure how to, all the while grumbling, "Not drunk. Can drink more." Wen Kexing and Gu Xiong followed Zhou's issue and Zhang Chengling back when they were traveling together, but only Zhou's issue noticed. Zhang Chengling at that time wasn't in a positive state of mind, therefore he didn't notice. He did meet Wen Kexing once at the shrine, but the man left no impression on him. Zhou's issue crashed on the table right when Zhang Chengling and Zhao Jing walked past, and they were completely clueless on their way to the upper floor. The waiter brought them food and wine after the other two had disappeared upstairs. One glance and he asked worriedly, "Wasn't this one really sober just a moment ago? How did he get drunk that quickly?" Zhou's issue sat up again with no problem before he could exclaim further and took the wine pot without even looking at the food. The waiter was dumbstruck as Zhou's issue waved his arm. "Didn't I say that I wasn't drunk and could drink more? I'm not the type to joke about that, you know." The waiter was experienced enough to turn and walked away, albeit stiffly. Wen Kexing laughed and asked with a low voice, "You scared of that kid?" Zhou's issue didn't spare him a look. "Why would I be scared of him? Then why did you hide?" Zhou's issue toyed with the peanuts and drank his wine in an unhurried manner, then answered vaguely, "Troubles. The moment he sees me he'll go Shifu this and Shifu that. He's clingy like a little girl." Wen Kexing's brows were raised. "Why did you save him back then? You even sold yourself for 2 kians." Zhou's issue munched on the peanuts, then spoke after a good while. He looked pitiful. Wen Kexing fell silent after that. Suddenly, he took out a money pouch from his chest and counted the silvers carefully before pushing them forward. "Here are 3 liangs and 2 kians. The 3 liangs are for my debt, And I want to buy you with 2 Tians. I promise I will care for you and let no one come after you. Zhou Zishu looked down at the gleaming silver and took a sip of wine, seemingly enjoying himself. He pushed 2 lions back. This is enough for the wine today. After mulling it over, he pushed the 2 Tians back to its owner too. I'm not selling myself to you. Wen Kai-sing had a mysterious smile on his face. Why is that? You look annoying, Zhou Zishu answered bluntly. Wen Kai-sing laughed as if it was an encouragement. Everyone fully arrived at Dongting half a month later. Gao Chong requested that a large temple courtyard nearby was used as the gathering location. After another half a day, Abbot Si Mu from Shaolin Temple came with some of his disciples to present the Second Realm's command piece. As expected, Monk Gu didn't appear in person. He ordered an around 20-year-old, respectable-looking disciple to come in his stead to present the last command piece. The night the 3 command pieces were reunited, the Gao's manor was set on fire. Chapter 19. Night of Fire. It was impossible for Zhou Zishu to stay asleep past midnight, and while he was meditating in his room, suddenly there were piercing, terror-laden screams from outside. His brows knitted as he stood up and pushed open the window. He saw people running past with their clothes rumpled before receiving an assault of smoke and flame directly to his face. Fire! Fire! The frosty night was gradually clogged up with thick smoke. It seemed like the fire was not far from where he was staying. Zhou Zishu thought, quite a big fire, judging from the smoke. But this is the Gao's manor, with the amount of people currently staying here, it can't be that hard to control it. He wanted no part of this, and closed the window since he was somewhat choked up from the smoke. An arm suddenly reached out, stopping him from closing the window. It even crudely copped a feel of the back of his hand before its owner quickly jumped inside, smiling at Zhou Zishu while slipping the window shut. Zhou Zishu judged the uninvited Wen Kai-sing from head to toe. He was about to say something when his nose itched, so he turned away to sneeze and firmly took 2 steps back, remaining a certain distance from this piece of scented pastry who must have strolled out of a place full of beauty products just now. Mr. Good Person Wen's hair was unkempt, tied up temporarily with a plain hairband. His clothes were not exactly disheveled, but the collar was wide open, a dark red mark evident on the snow-white fabric. The nauseating scent of beauty products exuded from his sleeves, and on his wrist was a faint mark created from the scratching of nails. Completed with his lecherous expressions, it was as if he couldn't wait to show people what kind of activities he had been doing. On instinct, Zhou Zishu fixed his own clothes and sat up straight, the feeling of moral superiority arising involuntarily. In that moment, compared to Wen Kai-sing, he felt like such a conscientious and upright gentleman. Wen Kai-sing plopped himself down on Zhou Zishu's bed. The bed sheets had gone cold, which meant the owner of the room had been up for a while. He asked, "Stop trying to be dignified, tell me, are you sleepless because you feel lonesome in this deep dark night? You should have told me so that I can drag you along." "Ha, Dongting, what a glorious place to be." Zhou Zishu laughed quietly and dropped his charade. He knew all too well himself that righteousness would only look proper on a righteous person, and he was the epitome of nothing was what it seemed. He looked at Wen Kai-sing meaningfully while replying. "Your timing is impeccable, Brother Wen. The moment you left, a fire started." He didn't get to finish the sentence as Wen Kai-sing's face paled, and he retorted indignantly, "Rubbish. I've been gone for hours now." Zhou Zishu was taken aback, at a loss as to why he would be so angry. Then he saw Wen Kai-sing looked him over, the anger receding to make way for his usual leering smile. "Are you changing tactics, Ashu? If you remove your disguise, I can show you how long it actually was." He specifically wiped his mouth after that, licking at the corner of his lips as if remembering something. Zhou Zishu stared at him in a daze, mindlessly holding a cup to his mouth to pretend drinking, but after a good while of no liquid flowing out, he finally noticed that the cup was actually empty. Wen Kai-sing looked at him with interest and thought that the other man was definitely blushing under his mask, even though he couldn't see it. He got more amused the more he thought about it and ended up bursting out a giggle. "Forgive my useless self." Zhou Zishu gritted through his teeth. Wen Kai-sing was now fully laughing out loud. Had everyone's focus not been on the fire, this bastard would have received a beating already, who could laugh while people's houses were burning down? Zhou Zishu felt like immoral was a word made specifically for Wen Kai crossing. Consequently, he stood up, tying his hair together and headed outside. He would rather face the fire than share a space with this person. While the fire, whose main source was from a guest room, had been largely put out, it had shaken the entirety of the manor. Gao Chong, pale-faced and frowning, was conversing with Deng Quan. Gao Xiaolian was beside them. Upon seeing him, she nodded at his direction with a sorrowful face, speaking apologetically, "My apologies, Big Brother Joe, for your disturbed rest." She already left a good impression on him, so he smiled, replying gently. Whose room was burning? They were interrupted by Wen Ka-sing, now carrying an outer robe, prancing out from Zhou Zishu's room. He draped the robe over Zhou Zishu's frame, then rested his chin on his shoulder, yawning lazily while smiling at Gao Xiaolian as a greeting with pretended drowsiness. Gao Xiaolian's face went red immediately as she averted her gaze. Her words came out with quickness. "We heard that it was that of the Zhang young master, but there was no harm done to him. He was talking with my father and his uncle until late night, so he stayed at a side room." The poor girl was looking at every direction at once. She saw Wen Ka-sing's arms around Zhou Zishu's waist with the scratch marks on one wrist and turned impossibly redder, mumbling, "I have to join my father now, to take a look at Zhang Chengling." Then she ran with her head lowered. Only then did Zhou Zishu seize Wen Ka-sing's wrists and remove it from his body, the sound of his bones cracking perfectly matching his current human expression. Wen Ka-sing smiled innocently. "Why the sour face, Ah Shu? Don't you have a young disciple to care about?" Zhou Zishu didn't let go of the other man's wrist, even holding it in front of his face for a better look. He smiled afterwards, eyes narrowing coldly at Wen Ka, crossing what kind of beauty who could have left such a pretty mark on you, brother Wen? Wen Ka-sing's eyes brightened instantly. "Are you jealous, Ah Shu? I want to devour you." After staring at him with eyes wide open, Wen Ka-sing became overjoyed and smiled. "Good, let's go back to the bedroom. I'm gonna let you devour me as you wish. Preferably more than once." It was truly unimaginable for someone to be constantly shameless like this. With a noise of contempt, Zhou Zishu threw Wen Ka-sing's own wrist back at his chest. He turned to see Zhang Chengling being surrounded with lots of people, his expression showing contemplation. Then he turned away with the intention of going back to his room. Zhang Chengling's room wouldn't catch fire for no reasons, and where did Wen Ka-sing go in the middle of the night? Why did he use him to pull a clumsy act in front of Gao Xiaolian? At that moment, Wen Ka-sing's soft voice asked behind him, "Ah Shu, in all the time I've known you, I've never seen you sleep after midnight, so are you?" Zhou Zishu's pupils contracted. While his face didn't change, his couldn't help but stop walking. Only to hear the other man continuing, "Are you so lonely that you can't rest for the whole night?" Zhou Zishu quickened his steps towards the room, as if Wen Ka-sing's words were farts that he had to run away from before he choked. Wen Ka-sing smiled and stopped talking. He stood there, looking at Zhang Chengling, who had become terribly thin in just a few months. The young boy seemed to have gotten a little taller, his face ashen like that of a corpse, mouth thin, eyes black and bright, showing bits of stubbornness and restraint. His whole body was seemingly carved from fire, burning away the old crybaby and leaving a young wolf in its stead. Only now was Wen Ka-sing starting to believe that this scamp was truly a child of the Sangs. He laughed softly, speaking at Zhang Chengling's direction without making a sound, "You better stay alert, brat." The next day, good old Wen found out that Saint Zhou, who immediately holed up in his room once Zhang Chengling came near, had vanished without a trace since the early morning, his room so tidy it gave almost no indication of someone having lived in it before. Even Zhou Zishu himself wasn't sure why he started following Zhang Chengling since morning. Always anticipating the worst, he found another layer of skin-like mask to put over his already carefully crafted one. He hid in the crowd like an apparition and went past people completely unnoticed. No one paid attention to a forgettable stranger in a plain set of clothes. Zhou Zishu remained a calculated distance away from Zhang Chengling. Everyone and their mother in this grand pugilist scene proclaimed their furious indignation, and then there was that kid who stayed silent and looked over all of them despite being the person worthy of a proclamation the most. His eyes were wide open, his face bare and honest. Zhou Zishu was suddenly reminded of someone, the person with thick brows and big eyes under the tree whom he saw in that dark, horrible cave. Liang Zhuxiao. He remembered their childhood vaguely. That brat Liang Zhuxiao called him senior brother, constantly clinging to him and making his life as inconvenient as possible while rambling to no end. Worse, he was a fool, always slow on the uptake. Back then Zhou Zishu was still young and impatient, so imagined his discontent and unpleasant expression when his master threw the rascal in. He shouldn't get angry as a big senior brother, so at times he would took some jabs at the kid. But he seemed to be completely oblivious, and wouldn't go away no matter what. Zhou Zishu ended up having to accept his situation as was. It took Liang Zhuxiao so much more effort than the normal person for things to get through to him, and he would ask questions the moment he hit a roadblock. When his big senior brother became infuriated with his inquiries, he put up with all of the harsh words and waited until brother's anger subsided to continue asking. Just like that Jong brat, they were like sticking plasters, refusing to let go once applied on the skin. But who knew the plaster would eventually wear off one day? Who knew that the once magnificent lord of CG Holdings, leader of Tian would one day become a ghost in the middle of the crowd, staring at a kid while agonizingly mourning the past? Chapter 20. Men in Red. The weather had no regards for the heroes gathered at Dongting, seeing how gloomy the sky was. It was as if something heavily suspended the rain in midair and it could fall down any time. The damp air was chilly and there were less and less fallen leaves. There was a man standing in the middle of this with sadness, thinking about his hometown. 30 years seemed like such a long dream. Cao Chong stepped down to let Abbot Simu take the reins. Zhou Zishu, while hidden in the crowd, heard the young man next to him sighed, "One day I should become someone like him." Xiongyu, the overlord of Western Chu, upon seeing Emperor Shi Huang's procession, had said, "I am fit to replace him." Lu Shu, the Emperor Guangwu during his younger years, also dazedly lamented, "Palace Guard leader is a worthy official title to strive for, just as Yin Li Hua is a worthy maiden to wed." In this vast and obscure world, who wouldn't want to give it their all and become a legendary hero fit for the history books? The adolescence years were always full of vitality, so it wasn't uncommon for someone to look up at a figure, gritting his teeth and clenching his fist while exclaiming, "One day, I should become someone like him." Someone who had the world in his power. But what came after the glory? Zhou Zishu's master passed away too soon, leaving the CG Holdings in chaos with a lack of a leader. Just like that, the responsibility fell on his shoulders as he is the big senior brother, but how much could a big senior brother really do? He was barely over 15 that year. The current emperor when he was 15 was still biding his time however he could. Nan Ningwang when he was 15 was indulging in wine and pleasure and letting them cloud his senses. Even the great shaman of South Xinjiang back when he was 15 was a kid stranded in a foreign land as hostage, full of resentfulness but had no way out. That's why Liang Zhuxiao in some ways had become his only solace as they depended on each other to live on. But since when did the cracks in their relationship appear? Maybe it was when Liang Zhuxiao visited the capital for the first time and saw the corrupted struggles, saw the increasingly horrible conflicts between families, saw brothers murdering each other in cold blood, saw all the crimes, framings, even deaths of loyal officials, behind all of which was the big senior brother whom he always looked up to. Gao Chong was already standing up, fiercely condemning the Ghost Valley in front of all the heroes. Zhou Zishu's eyes were downcast, as if he was sleeping. Not a single syllable of Liang Zhuxiao's interrogating words had once left his mind all these years. What are you all after, really? Power? The throne? Glory and wealth? Your fate will not end well if you continue down this road, please snap out of it. An eye for an eye is how it is, big brother. An eye for an eye? Why should blood be paid back with blood while in this world there were other ways to make people suffer without dying? Zhou Zishu smiled mockingly and thought, "Ah, Zhuxiao, we're both wrong after all." At that moment, there was a grunt interrupting Gao Chong's words and Zhou Zishu's train of thought. The noise sounded like it belonged to a child, but was also strangely raspy. There was internal force underlying Gao Chong's voice, so it was evident that this person was not your run-of-the-mill type, seeing how they were able to cut him off. They spoke louder. "Sir Gao, how can you come to the conclusion that the Ghost Valley's behind all this just with mere words? Isn't this a little far-fetched?" Everyone's gaze was drawn to one spot, not excluding Zhou Zishu. The one who spoke up was a dwarf-like man who was only around a meter tall, currently sitting on the shoulder of another man whose build was the complete opposite. Zhou Zishu could be considered tall compared to the average man, but even he had to crane his neck to look at this giant. His hair was wild and his beard was untamed, only leaving his dark eyes visible. He carried the dwarf with care, using his huge hands to grip the smaller man's legs to prevent him from falling. Weren't these Earth Lord Feng Xiaofeng and his wishy-washy friend Gao Shanyu? Their physical attributes were too distinctive, to the point that everyone knew who they were the moment they opened their mouths. There was a glint in Zhou Zishu's eyes. In fact, he harbored no bad feelings towards this Feng Xiaofeng at all. If the rumors were correct, he was someone with a gray morality and acted on his own emotions rather than following the rules. His physique might also be the one that contributed to his stubborn and unpredictable behaviors. Except for Gao Shanyu, to whom he was attached at the hip, he didn't listen to anyone else. In short, he was difficult. Feng Xiaofeng's voice was grating to the ears. "You're being unreasonable, Sir Gao, with your talk about those evildoers in the Ghost Valley. Of course the ghosts of Quangju Ridge have done a lot of despicable things, they would be decent human beings otherwise. But forgive me for being rude, because with the valley's strict rules forbidding people to leave once they enter and preventing the ghosts from causing mayhem for years, I don't see why they have to act up right at this moment. Gao Chong pursed his lips, his Buddha-like face no longer smiling. His eyes were unnaturally serious, carrying indescribable intimidation. He looked at Feng Xiaofeng for a good while, then asked slowly. Is that you, Brother Feng? What is your opinion then? Feng Xiaofeng sneered, spare me all of your niceties. You think I don't know how you're calling me brother on the outside but dwarf on the inside? Well, this dwarf has heard something through the grapevine and would like to give all you jobless heroes a warning, so that you don't go and do something embarrassing. Zhou Zishu had heard enough to confirm the rumors about this man for himself. Feng Xiaofeng was definitely not the malicious type, he was neutral at worst, but people-pleasing seemed to be non-existent in his vocabulary. Not only was he unpleasant, others would label him a mad dog without a doubt. There were whispers about how he cut off someone's tongue after they called him a dwarf. He would even cut the tongue of someone who would address him impolitely, and when they did show him politeness he would deem it a lie, a real tough nut to crack. Gao Chong frowned, but as a renowned hero he had to be courteous and not try to argue with a mad dog. So he asked in a civil manner, what rumors have you heard, Sir Feng? Feng Xiaofeng let out a cruel laugh, sounding not unlike a mystical bird. Why are you playing dumb, Gao Chong? I may know nothing about Mu Yanj and Yu Tianji's case, but do you dare say that the deaths of Zhang Yusin and the Patriarch of Taishan have no correlations to the lapis armor? At this, the expressions of those who were in the know changed immediately as whispers broke out. Zhou Zishu took note of Gao Chong seemingly turned to glance Abbot Simu with a grave expression. In contrast, Monku's young disciple who was sitting near Gao Chong paid no attention, his posture and attitude resembling a detached immortal. Zhang Chengling, sitting beside Zhao Jing, sneaked a look at the elder. He saw Zhao Jing's face turned into a mix of rage, contemplation and something else rather scary after lapis armor was uttered. The boy's impending question was stuck in his throat. In this relatively short amount of time, he had come to understand a lot of things. Zhang Chengling could see the contempt and pity in people's eyes and read it in their words. That's right, how could the famous Sir Zhang Yusin have such a coward for a son? He once heard the Zhao servants gossiping in secret about whether it was worth it for hundreds of people to lay down their lives just for a kid. With him being incompetent in every aspect, how could they expect him to avenge Sir Zhang and rebuild the Zhang family? They only saw him as a mascot to express their hatred for the Ghost Valley, then they would turn to him and said, ah, the Zhang orphan. Don't worry, kid, we will seek justice for your father and family. A helpless, pitiful mascot. Zhang Chengling's thoughts strayed to the sickly and quiet man he met in the abandoned shrine that day. Ever since that horrific night, he could never sleep without encountering nightmares, but who would care if he told them? Even Uncle Zhao would tell him to straighten his spine and stop it from getting to him, that everyone would stand beside him to avenge the Sangs. There was no one else who would embrace his shoulders and talk to him softly, that it's all right, sleep all you want. I'll wake you if there's a nightmare. Seeing that chaos had broken out, Feng Xiaofeng's smirk remained as he requested that Gao Chong gave everyone an explanation about the lapis armor. Zhang Chengling lowered his head and was kneading his temples when there was a stealthy rush of wind flew at him, carrying a tiny ball of paper to hit his palm directly. Zhang Chengling startled, and after seeing that no one was noticing him, he bent down and picked up the paper ball. Written on it was simply, "Follow me if you want to know the truth." When Zhang Chengling looked up, in the crowd there was a man in dark clothes who was staring at him without blinking. A cruel sneer seemed to be hung at the corner of his lips, his gaze dark and disdainful as if he was sure that the boy wouldn't follow him. In a blink of an eye, not sure if it was out of being over-emotional or impulsive, Zhang Chengling gripped the note tightly. Taking advantage of the current commotion, he quietly left Zhao Jing's side and followed the strange man through the crowd. No one noticed him except for Zhou Zishu. Zhou Zishu always had half of his attention on Zhang Chengling, and his keen eyes immediately noticed and alarming him of the man shooting the note at the boy. Seeing that Zhang Chengling discarded all notions of danger and went after the man alone, he frowned and immediately abandoned the hero's quarrel to chase after the boy in secret. The man seemed to be toying with him, disappearing as soon as Zhang Chengling followed him, but not long after that, there would be small rocks shooting at him from different directions, apparently mocking his extremely terrible Qinggong, like a cat playing with a mouse. Zhang Chengling gritted his teeth, unconsciously able to pursue further and further. He didn't have an aptitude for these physical activities, and after he arrived at the Zhao's holdings, everyone was too busy about doing heroic deeds to remember to teach him more kung fu. Soon enough, His angry chase left him out of breath and dizzy. He could almost hear the sound of his pulse by the temples. Never before had the spoiled boy been so angry with himself. He heard someone snort, "This is John Yuson's brat? What a waste," he thought. "That's right, you're a waste, Zhang Chengling. Why did Uncle Li risk his life to save you? Why did it have to be you?" The man then appeared in front of him, hands like claws twisting his neck. His gaze at Zhang Chengling was sinister. When the boy's body warmth slowly started to disintegrate, he realized they were standing on deserted land. Shadows appeared seemingly from nowhere behind the man with the same fashion, circling around Zhang Chengling. The one who led him here laughed quietly and released him. He raised his voice, "My poorly hidden friend, why must you be so worked up over a boy like this?" A man dressed in deep red stepped forward at that. On his face was a red birthmark, making his features incredibly formidable at first glance. Zhang Chengling's legs started to tremble, but he tried his best to keep his chin up and feigned courage at the man in red. The man suddenly laughed, the dry sound not unlike that from a rusty fan, causing goosebumps to erupt across the skin. In just a blink, he materialized in front of Zhang Chengling and held the boy's neck. His fingers were cold like a corpse's, and for a brief moment Zhang Chengling mistook him for an undead. Then the man asked softly, "Let me ask you, that night at the Zhang's Holdings, did you see a man with a missing finger?" Zhang Chengling's eyes were as wide as saucers as he tried to shake his head. The man narrowed his eyes, softening his voice even more. "No? Think again, my good boy, did you see him? Or did you not?" The softer his voice was, the stronger his grip became. Zhang Chengling tried to breathe and struggle out of the grip with all his might, his face reddening, but all of his retaliating punches were futile. He rasped, "Fuck you." The man in red seemed not to notice, a demonic smile appearing on his face. "Yes. Or no?" Zhang Chengling felt like his chest was going to burst. He knew this man wanted him to say yes, but right at this life and death moment, his stubbornness awoke with a vengeance as he spit on the man's face. The grip quickly turned crueler, and Zhang Chengling had no more strength to struggle. The man's voice was still gentle. "I'm asking you once again, yes or no?" Zhang Chengling was slipping out of consciousness. He thought, "This is it." Suddenly, the man let out a sound of pain and let go of the boy. Air rushed into his lungs and he stumbled backwards, eventually falling on the ground with a thud, coughing painfully. The man in red took a few steps back, eyes glancing at the rock that almost broke his wrist with hostility. "Who's there?"